these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. We're going to talk about the environment today. It is a hot topic, as you can imagine, and listen to this podcast if you're a long-time listener and you've already given me 5 stars, and if you haven't, I don't know what you're doing with your life. But if you have, then you know I talk about this issue a lot. Being from Houston, I'm now on Energy and Commerce Committee, so and I'm on the Environment Subcommittee. So this is a really big deal. I care about the environment. I call myself a rational environmentalist. I'm not a radical environmentalist. And I fear that the Democrat Party has been taken over by nothing but radical environmentalists. And I hope to be proven wrong, maybe in these some of these hearings and debates that I'll have on the committee, but we'll see. So we're going to continue getting the right information out from very smart people who know what they're talking about. That's why I have Robert Bryce on. Robert, thanks so much for being on.
Happy to be with you, Dan. Thanks.
So you're in Austin right now. You're Texas-based, like all the good people are. And you're an author, journalist, podcaster, film producer, public speaker. You've been writing about this issue for decades. Your work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, National Review, Field and Stream, Austin Chronicle. You were working at the Austin Chronicle for like 12 years, I believe. You just came out with a new documentary called Juice: How Electricity Explains the World. You can find that on Amazon Prime. So we'll talk about that. You've got like 1 million books. I'll read some of the titles so people get an idea of what you write about here. Your first book, Pipe Dreams: Greed, Ego, and the Death of Enron. So that won won an award, I think, or named one of the best nonfiction books by Publishers Weekly. You wrote the Cronies, Oil, the Bushes, and the Rise of Texas, America's Superstate. Okay, I do have questions about that. That's quite the title too. So I want to know what you're talking about there. Gusher of Lies: The Dangerous Delusions of Energy Independence. I want to ask you about that one, too, just to see if that one has aged well. Power Hungry: The Myths of Green Energy and the Real Fuels of the Future. That would be fascinating, too. That's probably something that you and I both agree on and we'll talk about quite a bit, as well as this one. Smaller, Faster, Lighter, Denser, Cheaper: How Innovation Keeps Proving the Catastrophists Wrong. That's a difficult word. See, I would have recommended maybe not putting that in the title because I don't know how to say it. Makes me feel stupid. But anyway, thanks for. Oh no, you just have a recent one too. A Question of Power: Electricity and the Wealth of Nations.
A Question of Power.
So we'll plug all of those, or you plug them as necessary and as they relate to our conversation. Sure. But before we started recording, we were, you were talking about being in Austin. You're like, well, this is where all the Californians are escaping to. And, then we were talking about the politics of that. Are they turning Texas blue? That's sort of a separate discussion. But what are they escaping from? I mean, what are you hearing from your neighbors who are escaping to Austin? And what is going on in California? And why doesn't their super green, their own version of the Green New Deal work?
Well, I mean, they're having blackouts now. I mean, that's the amazing thing. That is that, for months now, the Pacific Gas and Electric has having forced blackouts because of wildfire danger and so on. I mean, I've been to Beirut. In fact, I talk about, we went to Beirut for the film. I write about Beirut in my new book. Beirut moved to California. I mean, so many Californians now, they can't rely on, even a friend of mine who works in the utility business, he told me the other day, his colleagues are buying their own home generators. I mean, imagine that. You work for a utility and your electricity is so undependable, you have to buy yourself a generator. So I think it's partly the energy issues that are their cost of energy is very high. Cost of housing is very high. The regulatory regime is extreme. I think it's just a combination of all of those things: extremely high cost of living and difficulty in just managing the skein of regulatory hurdles that they have to manage as business people and as entrepreneurs. Yeah,
it amazes me that I saw a headline recently in some mainstream publication that said that was the basis of the headline was basically California is the baseline, the policy baseline for the rest of the country, coming from the progressive left. And that's just fascinating to me, considering there's such an exodus away from California. I mean, it's just like the progressive elites live on a totally different planet. And are just so out of touch with basic needs and also just basic analysis of costs and benefits of their policies.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think that the energy part of this is and energy and climate is the basis of it. And a lot of this, the push toward the left, that California's bias is we're going to lead the world on climate change issues. Well, okay, but when you look at what they've done, and I've been tracking this, I wrote a paper for the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity about the natural gas bans that are being implemented in California. Now, this is truly remarkable that natural gas grids have been a sign of progress and prosperity in cities all over the world for 200 years. And now California is saying, because of climate change, they're instituting regulations. Now, over 40 different municipalities and local governments have said, we're going to ban or restrict the use of natural gas in the home, which I see this as just an enormously wrong move on a whole bunch of levels, particularly just look at the basic facts. So you won't be able to use gas. You're going to have to rely on electricity in a state with one of the poorest performing grids in the country. So, I mean, there are parts of this that just make no sense to me at all. And one last point, I think it was in December, San Jose and Oakland both passed bans on gas in new buildings. That same week, PG&E announced an 8% or was approved an 8% rate hike. So, they're saying you can't use nat gas at the same time electricity rates are soaring.
Yeah, and it is that, God, and it's all related, obviously. It all sort of ends in this sort of destructive electrical apocalypse. But why, help our viewers understand, why is the electric grid in California so bad? Why is it so underperforming?
Well, it's a very good question. And I had on my podcast, the Power Hungry podcast a few weeks ago, I had a wonderful woman. Well, I have her book here right at hand somewhere. Here it is. It's called Shorting the Grid by Meredith Angwin. And she talked about what she calls the fatal trifecta, which I thought is just a brilliant analysis. What's the fatal trifecta? Over-reliance on natural gas. I'm pro-natural gas. Over-reliance on natural gas, over-reliance on imported electricity, and over-reliance on renewables. And California had all of those things that led to the blackouts that hit the state last year. So that is one of the things that, in terms of the big picture, in terms of basic electric grid management, California is just failing at in a remarkably public and an extraordinarily expensive manner.
So they have an over-reliance on natural gas, but they're also banning it. So I assume that makes their situation even worse, because if you're banning the thing that you're already reliant upon.
Right. Over-reliance on gas for electricity generation.
Yeah.
Right. That's her point, right, in terms of production, because California had forced the closure of several natural gas plants. And now they said, oh, wait a minute. No, we're going to keep those open after the blackouts. They made that decision.
Yeah. And they're closing nuclear plants as well, or just not building new ones. I mean, why is the left, just in general? I mean, why do they hate nuclear so much?
That is a really good question, Dan. And I've written about it a lot. Written about it in my last 3 books. The Sierra Club has led the anti-nuclear charge in America for 50 years. And I wrote a piece in Forbes, in fact, last year. The Democratic Party last year, for the first time in 48 years, endorsed the use of nuclear power, which, now they're in power. Now they're in power and control the House, the Senate, and the White House. Will they really express that? But I think part of it is that they view nuclear, they conflate the issue of nuclear energy with nuclear weaponry. But also, I think it's just some knee-jerk reaction against high tech, and somehow they think renewables are better. So it's not just that they're anti-nuclear; it's that they think renewables are the only way that we should be powering our economy.
But it's like a feeling, right? That's what drives me nuts. And there's not a real explanation as to why they feel that way. They just do feel that way, and it's almost religious. It's like singing from a hymn almost. It's interesting.
No, I think that religious. I think the fervent belief that we have sinned against the earth, right? That we humans are bad is part of that. That this is a type of religion in terms of the ideas of original sin, and we've committed a sin against nature, therefore we must repent, and we can only then use natural, quote, natural sources of energy, solar and wind. Never mind that to scale them up requires massive amounts of mining and is terrible for wildlife and all those other things that we could discuss. But it is a religious type of debate. And that's one reason why the debate overall, I think, is so stuck.
Yeah, it's frustrating. I couldn't help but wonder when you were mentioning the new movie that you guys came out with, and then you were in Beirut coming to California. I didn't know what you meant by that. I'm always because I'm a little bit fascinated as to what you were doing in Beirut and how does that tie into the question of how electricity explains the world?
Yes, it does. Thanks. We traveled. I went to India, Iceland, Lebanon, Puerto Rico, Colorado, New York. We traveled over 60,000 miles and made a 90-minute documentary or 82-minute documentary. But we really focused on the electricity side. We looked at the world through the lens of electricity. Mm-hmm. And what we found, and it's one of the key points in the film, is that the electric grid is almost a perfect reflection of the society it powers. And so you go to Iceland, well, they have lots of hydro, they have lots of geothermal. It's a very small country. Well, they can go 100% renewable on their electric grid because they have all this thermal and all this geothermal and all this hydro.
It's very unique. Yeah.
Beirut, nearly everyone pays 2 electric bills in Beirut. And it was one of the reasons why I wanted to go there. They're notorious for the generator mafia. And so everyone pays one bill to EDL, the state-run grid operator, but there are blackouts every day in Beirut. Yeah. So they have another bill that they pay to the local generator, known as the generator mafia, because they want to have power all the time. And so it's just a reflection. That is a reflection of this endemic corruption that has been crippling Lebanon for decades.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by Lebanon. I worked there a little bit as a SEAL. I didn't know I wasn't necessarily in tune at the time with their electrical grid problems. So again, what's the explanation there? I mean, why do they have blackouts? I mean, it's just kind of a fascinating question. In general, it helps us think of new solutions for the future.
Sure. Well, it's interesting you've been in Beirut because, of course, the story in Beirut is that every spy in the world eventually goes to Beirut, right? This is the hotbed for
100%
spies and intrigue, and that this is everybody wants to influence Lebanon.
There's a lot of romanticism surrounding the country of Lebanon, and I mean, I love it. There's something about that country that just attracts people, and it's I think it's a very cool place.
Yeah, the Paris of the Middle East. I'd wanted to go there for decades, and it didn't disappoint. I don't want to go back right now. Believe me, I've been there once. But the short answer to why their grid is so is crippled, and it's the same in Puerto Rico. It's a one-word answer: corruption. That there is endemic corruption in that country. There's endemic corruption, unfortunately, in Puerto Rico, but and a lot of other places where grids don't work. But if the grids don't have integrity, if the society doesn't have integrity, it's reflected in electricity service. And so, Lebanon has been a fractured country for decades, and that is even more fractured today.
So, okay, then let's move back to Texas now. Because
sure.
When I was reading through this list of books, this one really stuck out to me. The Cronies, Oil, the Bushes, and the Rise of Texas, America's Superstate. So what's behind that title? Sorry, I didn't get to read all your books.
Sure. Well, that book was published now 16, 17 years ago.
Yeah, it's 2004. Yep.
And it was an outgrowth of my first book. What I found, I've written 6 books that one book just kind of leads me to another, right? The themes in it. And so my first book was on Enron and the failure of Enron. And as I wrote about that book, I realized the legacy and the rise of Texas politicians, and in particular, Sam Rayburn, LBJ, and I would argue both Bushes, and I did in the book, is the state's oil wealth. That, you read about how Lyndon Johnson prevailed in 1948 in various accounts. He was able to get sackfuls of cash from the biggest oil barons of the day, and that funded his campaign. And so that the oil wealth and the mineral wealth in Texas then was expressed in politics and through the politicians that were able to come from Texas and use that mineral wealth as to fund their political campaigns and political aspirations. That's the book in a nutshell. But I think it's also one of the things interesting as I thought about it a lot since then. Is that the book kind of posed this question: is America going to adopt the Texas model or the California model? And now, I think 17 years later, it's clear that people in California are voting with their feet and saying, "Well, we think the Texas model might be better."
Yeah, I mean, on many fronts. But I mean, so actually, the Texas model, when it comes to electricity, is interesting. We're the only state that's on our own power grid.
Right.
Can you help listeners understand that? I'm not always great at trying to explain it. And what are the pros and cons? What does it allow us to do? What does it not? How does it hurt us? What do you think about Texas being? I think we're number one on wind energy, and you probably share a lot of my skepticism on solar and wind as this amazing new future. I'm not against it. I just don't think it's this this promising thing that we can just rely on. But what do you think about it? How does it affect the Texas energy grid? Do we have problems? How could we be better?
Sure. Well, you're right. Texas is anomalous. When people say, "Oh, well, look at all the wind in Texas." Okay, well, sure, but Texas, as is the electric grid in Texas, is ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. It's a regional transmission organization. Texas is unique, as you said, in that it has its own RTO. But not other states. Very few other states can do, if any, can do what Texas has done in terms of wind and in terms of transmission. So 2 points. One is Texas is a big place. So there are a lot of areas where wind energy can be built and it doesn't disturb a lot of people, right? Because, out in West Texas, Abilene, Sweetwater, that area, there's a lot of cactus and rattlesnakes and not very many people. That's not the case in New York.
Or trees, right? You're not destroying a bunch of things.
You can't build new wind in New York. It's so unpopular in the state of New York that the state in Albany, they're ready to override local zoning ordinances to force local communities to accept wind and solar. That's how unpopular it is. You can't build wind and solar in California. And these are in two states that have some of the most aggressive climate goals. So it's indicative of the land use conflicts that are coming to the fore in states all across the country. It's not just New York and California. But Texas is different in that, we have a lot of space. And because it's a big state, we were able to build. The state mandated this building of the CREZ lines, a long intrastate high voltage transmission system that brought wind from West Texas and North Texas down into the where Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin are. But remember, those lines were paid for by ratepayers. It wasn't free. That every ratepayer in Texas pays something on their monthly bill. I think it's about $5 to pay for the cost of those high voltage transmission lines. Why is that significant? It's because those lines didn't have to cross state boundaries. And that's one of the big limiting factors in high voltage transmission in the United States is building interstate high voltage transmission is extraordinarily difficult.
Why is it difficult?
Well, this is the high voltage transmission. The companies that are building it don't have the power of eminent domain. Pipelines do, right? We could talk about the Keystone XL and some of the controversies around that. But if you're building an oil or gas pipeline, those companies can use eminent domain to appropriate to obtain the land they need to run the pipelines. The high voltage transmission operators don't have that ability. So you have entire states rejecting high voltage transmission, interstate high voltage transmission projects, including Arkansas, Iowa. Big fight over it in Missouri. There was a big fight over it in Oklahoma. So effectively, there's been no interstate transmission of any size built in several years in the United States.
Okay, so would it be a good thing if there was? What would that allow us to do?
Well, that's one of the big debates now. In fact, is the all renewable proponents. So the people are saying, "Oh, we need to build out all this, enormous amounts of new wind and so on." Well, it's easy to say, but it's hard to do because you have county governments, local government, city governments, town governments that are saying, well, you're going to build these 200-foot pylons through our town. What do we get for it? Mm-hmm. So it is part of the broader land use conflict issue that I've been covering now for more than 10 years that I think is only going to become more acute in the years ahead.
Okay, so I'm trying to put this into layman's terms. I mean, the problem is if you're gonna build giant wind farms, you can't build them near towns. You can't build them for the reasons you stated. People don't want them around. And there's good reasons not to want them around. Look at them. I mean, they destroy a lot of wildlife. They're not great. But if you do build them, you can build them out in the middle of nowhere, but you need transmission lines to get from the middle of nowhere to the middle of somewhere. And that's both expensive, requires a lot of materials, requires a lot of industry, right? And I thought the left didn't like industry. So you got to build things, a lot of steel, a lot of all of that. And then to layer on top of that problem, just because of the way our laws and interstate commerce work, it's difficult to even build those transmission lines in between states. But they're still even difficult, and it's not even clear that it's a great idea from a policy perspective and from a cost-benefit perspective to even build all this extra transmission lines in the first place, just so you can feel good about where that electricity is coming from. Is that kind of accurate?
Yeah, that's a great summary. And I'll just add a couple of quick thoughts. One is there's an old saw in the utility business that it's easier to move molecules than electrons. And if you think about it, you have a pipeline, you can move the molecule of hydrocarbons, gas or gasoline or diesel fuel or whatever through a pipeline. Well, it's underground and people don't see it. You move electrons, you have to have these pylons that are 200 feet high and people see them all the time. Yeah. And they have red blinking lights on them, and they're bad for property values. They're bad for view sheds. And these battles are happening. And now big battle is underway in New York over this. There's a big battle over was it a year and a half ago or so? The state of New Hampshire rejected a high voltage transmission project that was supposed to bring electricity from Hydro-Quebec into Massachusetts. And New Hampshire said, we don't get anything from this. Forget it. We're not going to allow this. So the states have a big say. And I think it's going to be difficult for Congress to override that and say, oh, no, King's X, we're the federal government. We're going to force you to take these high voltage transmission lines. I think that's a very difficult political battle in Congress. Now, you're more expert on that than I am, but as far as I see it, that's a very difficult battle to say, oh no, we're gonna override your prerogative as a state. That's a difficult argument to make.
Yeah, and I don't want to make it because I don't even agree with it. So I mean, that's it would be difficult. It should be difficult. Good,
because I think it wouldn't be fun.
Yeah, and again, it's like, okay, so let me get this straight. You want to import energy from, like let's say hydropower from Quebec, like in this case. You want to cut a bunch of land up in New Hampshire, bring it down to New York, so you can say that you're getting your electricity from hydropower. That'll, you got a lot of problems here just right off the bat. I think one is just the destruction to land that occurs through that many miles of transmission lines, the amount of building that has to occur, the amount of steel that has to be produced to build that in the first place, which does require something other than solar and wind and hydro, right? It requires like real fossil fuels to build that. So they don't like to explain that part in their entire calculation. You're also losing. There's a loss, right? The longer you try to transmit electrons, there's an energy loss there, so you're not really getting what you pay for. And like another option is just build a nuclear plant or a gas powered plant where you actually need the energy and have a lot, and you just remove all those other problems. But they hate that, or just build natural gas pipeline underground to New York, which they hate also, and they've deliberately, they're in the Northeast, they're constantly trying to battle against that.
Well, I think you make a great point, and I think that's one of the reasons why I've been adamantly pro-nuclear. I had a piece I published in Forbes just a few days ago talking about that. If the fact that if President Biden is serious about climate change, then he should be working to prevent the closure of the reactors that are slated for closure this year. There are 3 plants, 2 in Illinois and the Unit 3 reactor at Indian Point in New York. Mm-hmm. Well, those 3 plants together, Dan, produce 43 terawatt hours of electricity per year. That's more electricity than is produced by all of the solar in California. It's 3 times all the geothermal production in the U.S. It's nearly equal to all of the solar produced in Germany. But these plants are being allowed to close. And now some of them, they're economically challenged because the way the grid has been structured and the fact that they're not getting the kind of subsidies solar and wind are. But the point that I'm trying to get to making now, I'll just finish with this point, is that those plants are very dense. They have a very small footprint, and you can build them close to cities, so you don't need the big you don't have to build high voltage transmission. So the amount of friction that is now facing this idea that we're going to go to 100% renewables, we're going to decarbonize the electric grid there, and it's going to be extraordinarily difficult and will cost, according to Wood Mackenzie, $4.5 trillion. That's a lot of money.
Yeah, and one of the difficulties we have as policymakers is that question of, okay, so what does it mean not to let a nuclear plant close? What do we have to do to make sure it doesn't close? It is challenging. It's not exactly clear to me. Do you have any ideas on that?
Well, look, it is a simple thing to fix, but politically unpopular to do. So you look at Illinois. Who owns those plants? It's Exelon Corporation. Well, I'm not going to volunteer to have a bake sale for Exelon. I mean, this is their annual revenues are $30 billion a year, something on that order. But they said, well, the way the system is structured, we are not making a rate of return on those plants that commensurate with the amount of investment and the cost of operating them.
Yeah.
So I also wrote recently about the subsidies, the federal tax incentives that are being given to solar. Yeah. They're 250 times greater than the subsidies being given in federal tax incentives to nuclear.
Yeah.
So
that should be technology neutral. It's very frustrating on my part is that there should not be solar and wind tax credits. There should be carbon-free tax credits that are technology neutral, because then you could apply those to even gas-powered plants that engage in carbon capture technology, and at least incentivize that. I don't know if that would help those nuclear plants.
And that could be a way that you levelize those tax credits across all of those different sources, and then that could help those nuclear plants stay open. But and one of the things that was disturbing to me, and you're a member of the House of Representatives, but that those tax credits were extended, where there were extensions added to the massive spending bill that passed in December, 5,593 pages, if I remember. But to me, that's political malpractice. Why are we allowing those extensions to just be slipped in there? It doesn't make any sense.
It's extremely frustrating. It gets to a much longer conversation about the nature of omnibus bills and the nature of negotiations. And people are like, well, why don't you guys just do things discreetly and pass bills one at a time? And I say, I agree with that. But unless you impose that constitutionally, you're always going to end up in this situation where, listen, the negotiations happen. The Democrats say, we won't even come to the table unless these things are in there. And so we say, fine, then we won't come to the table unless these things are in there. And that's just how it works. And it's difficult to see how you get around that. But that's a separate political discussion. Speaking of subsidies, one thing we always hear is about oil and gas subsidies. I'm just not aware of any direct subsidies to oil and gas companies. What the heck are they talking about when they talk about this?
Well, I think the main one is the depletion allowance. I've studied that. In fact, I wrote about it in Cronies, a book you referenced earlier, that this has been one of the criticisms of the oil and gas industry for decades, even going back to the 1940s, that this is an unconscionable subsidy for the oil and gas industry because they're able to reduce the taxes that they show the taxes they owe by claiming the depletion allowance. In addition, they get accelerated depreciation on their drilling costs. So those are the main ones. And you can look at the U.S. Treasury reports on this, and they're line items that show what they cost. So is it a subsidy? Well, yeah, it is. But when you compare it on an amount of energy produced basis, it's vanishingly small compared to the subsidies, the tax incentives that are being given to solar and wind. So if we're going to have a level playing field in terms of, well, okay, you can reduce it because they're not carbon free, but still, if you're going to have anything like a reasonable approach in terms of tax incentives and federal stance toward that, then it has to consider the overall amount of energy produced, not just that we like these guys and we don't like those guys.
Yeah, and it's also, in this debate, I always say it's important to recognize there is a difference, and people say I'm splitting hairs. I'm really not. There's a true difference, like from a policy perspective, from a philosophical perspective, between reducing tax liability and direct subsidies in the form of tax credits. Like, these are very different things. I mean, one is there's an actual cost, and one is, well, we could have taxed you more, but we didn't. And I'm sorry, but those two things are just very, very different. And like, I don't like that the common talking point that's thrown out there, oh, there's all those massive subsidies to oil and gas. And I'm like, well, if that's the argument, then any I guess tax deduction for a business could be considered a subsidy, but it's not. I mean, we just have to be careful with our language because words matter, and if we're trying to have a substantive policy debate. So that's why I wanted to clear that up for the audience, because and
if I could just add one thing that pops into my head, Dan, as you talk about that, is the White House Council on Economic Advisors, I think it was last year, maybe 2019, came out with a study that looked at the effects of the shale revolution. And the bottom line was they said that they estimated that the shale revolution, primarily because of lower natural gas prices, was saving an average family of four about $2,500 per year.
Wow.
Well, that's a big number. But what to me, the important part of that is, why did the shale revolution happen? It wasn't, the oil and gas industry wasn't propelled by tax incentives. In fact, what happened to the oil and gas industry was that they destroyed about $300 billion in capital. They had net negative cash flow, according to Deloitte, of over $300 billion, wrote off $450 billion in assets by essentially running themselves, many of them, out of business because they made oil and gas too cheap. Mm-hmm. So when the history is written of this era of the shale revolution and how it changed America's fortunes globally in terms of imports and exports. We're a big LNG exporter. We're a crude oil exporter. We're an importer of other refined commodities. It is a remarkable story, and one that is due to American entrepreneurial talent and private mineral rights and a whole lot of other things.
So I want to kind of get an interesting way to keep going along this conversation is just following your book titles. Gusher of Lies, The Dangerous Delusions of Energy Independence. So this was from 2008. I mean, did this one age well? Because it feels like we've got a pretty solid path towards energy independence if we want it. It doesn't seem like the Biden administration wants that. But how do you feel now versus when you wrote this in 2008?
Sure. Well, clearly the shale revolution started right about in 2008. That was that year oil and natural gas prices peaked. We had $150 oil for a few months. Natural gas prices were over $8 per MMBTU.
Yep.
But the basic point that I make in the book is that we're not independent. We are living an interdependent world. The U.S. is now exporting crude, but we're also importing crude.
Yeah,
so you have to weigh
that.
the different kinds of. We're very much more integrated into the global market now in terms of the crude market than ever before. Well, so just a brief explanation. American refiners, particularly on the Gulf Coast, they own refineries, that they're very complex. They can handle heavy sour crudes that they get at a discount relative to the benchmark prices at Cushing or the Brent price. Well, then they make the crack spread. That's the difference between how much they pay for the crude and how much they get paid for selling diesel and gasoline and the other things they make. So America is exporting light sweet crude that's not economic for American refiners to use. Right. So the essence of my point here is that, we're still interdependent. We're not independent. We're, who's dependent on who? If I buy a sandwich from you, am I dependent on you for my sandwich, or are you dependent on me for my cash? We're interdependent.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's fair. It's still true. I think we could be if we wanted to. We'd have to obviously invest a lot of money into changing those refineries, and then the question would be why. If it's working fine as it is. This title is really good too. The Myths of Green Energy. So, what are the myths of green energy? I think we've probably hit on some of them already, but give me your take on this.
Well, the myths of green energy is one that we can solely rely on renewables. We can't, and yet this is the the claim that we hear over and over and over again from big environmental groups, from some of the academics at some of the most elite institutions in America, Stanford. There was a new study from Princeton that just came out, MIT, Cal Berkeley, saying, oh, well, renewables are so cheap, we're just going to rely on them. Well, no, we're not, because they're intermittent. They require a lot of land, and they require a lot of rare earth elements. Who controls the market in rare earth elements? China. So this idea that, oh, we're just going to switch over our energy and power systems to something else. No, we won't. So there are a lot of myths. But the other point that I make in that book, and the real fuels of the future, natural gas and nuclear. And that's been something that I've been writing about now for over a decade, that if we're serious about reducing carbon emissions and we want cheap, abundant, reliable energy and power, these are the best no regrets paths forward. That those fuel sources, those sources of energy are low carbon, they're scalable, and the U.S. has the technology to provide both of them on the global market.
Yeah, there's a lot of agreement there that sort of that gets in line with some of the legislation that we look at, and hopefully some of the reasonable debates that we'll have in Congress. I don't know how much of that will happen, but maybe at least some on the nuclear front. And hopefully it doesn't get torpedoed in the sense that, for the reasons we discussed earlier, which is what happens is, okay, you agree on a certain part in a bill, and then the other side will add a bunch of other things to the bill they know you can't vote for, and they make you vote against the thing you agree with, just so they can say, look how crazy they are. They don't even agree with nuclear power. You know what I mean? This is the game that gets played, unfortunately. Okay, what about, and then, to add to that, so one, it's just impossible, as you noted. But why is it, why? I think is what a lot of people don't realize. And does it have to do with energy density, base power load, some of the transmission lines problems that we noted earlier, and just making it, right? The rare earth mineral production that's required to even make these things.
Sure. Well, I'll give you the answer. What I write about in Power Hungry, my fourth book. There are 4 reasons. It's power density, energy density, cost, and scale. Well, so take those in order. Power density. What is power density? It's the amount of energy that you can harvest, or energy flow that you can harvest from a given area, volume, or mass. Mm-hmm. So the power density of biofuels like ethanol is measured in the tenths of a watt per square meter. Wind energy, I don't care where you put it, onshore, offshore, doesn't matter, 1 watt per square meter. Solar, about 10 watts per square meter. Natural gas and nuclear, you're into thousands of watts per square meter. So the footprint matters. It matters enormously. And if you need a big footprint, and the lower the power density, the higher the resource intensity. If you're starting with low power density, ethanol, you need a tractor, you need diesel fuel, you need fertilizer, you need a lot of land. The same thing with wind. You need a lot of concrete, you need a lot of copper, a lot of lithium, a lot of these other things. So these are directly related. But I think if I was going to boil it down, why can't we just switch our system over to renewables? It's fundamentally basic physics, and that's power density.
Yeah. Well, and also, is there a difference? So Bill Gates famously says, okay, you can't. How are you going to make steel? If we just transitioned everything to solar and wind, you can't make steel. So I guess from a scientific standpoint, why can't we make steel with solar and wind? Because I say that all the time, but I think you can explain I think you can describe it a little bit better.
Well, sure. I mean, coal has been, what is the term of art for that type of anthracite coal? Coal has been part of the steel making process for hundreds, 200 years. That process is well proven. Now, reaching those high temperatures to produce steel, there have been some demonstration projects with concentrated solar that claim that they can use that for making steel. But then what about anhydrous ammonia? How are you going to make ammonia without natural gas? That's the other, what propelled the Green Revolution. It was the Haber-Bosch process. And what does the Haber-Bosch process rely on? It relies on natural gas. So, these ideas, we can just switch all these industrial processes. Well, where are we going to get our fertilizer? What is going to drive the tractors that are going to till the fields? These investigations and these claims of renewables don't take those next steps to say, well, how are we going to eat if we don't have synthetic fertilizer? And I think that's an important question that often ignored.
Yeah, but of course they would just kind of say, "Well, solar powered tractors, right?" I mean, or I think, and I always try to like understand what
those are so common, and John Deere makes all kinds of them, right? A solar powered tractor. I like the idea. How big are those solar panels going to have to be for the guy sitting on the tractor?
Very large.
It's funny,
right? And
very
very large, and And I guess the point I was trying to make is like, steel requires extremely high temperatures. It requires a lot of energy. Forget about some of the other things that you mentioned. There's other actual resources in the form of natural gas and fossil fuels and coal that literally go into the making of it. But I'm just talking about the energy. And it's right. Like there's a question of, can solar and wind even provide that energy as a base load? And the answer seems to be no.
Yeah, no, I agree. So let me, if you don't mind, I just flip the tables on you just a minute. I mean, what do you make of the first moves of the Biden administration? Because before he was inaugurated, I thought my question that I had was, is he going to attack to the center on some of these climate and energy policies? Because it's one thing to campaign, it's another thing to govern. But the early indications are that he's moving further left and faster than I expected. What's your take?
Yeah, as far as political strategy, it's a little. I mean, we could interpret it a number of ways. One, they just don't care what we think. So, if you're the Democrats and you're a student of history, you might just believe right off the bat you're going to lose the House and probably maybe the Senate in 2 years. So you might as well just go, just full on as far as you can in 2 years. It's sort of what they did in 2008 as they used all their political capital to get through Obamacare. So that might be part of it. They just don't care what we think. They might want to get the controversial stuff out of the way initially so that by the time elections come around, then they start to tack to the center and try to trick everybody into believing that, that they really just are pragmatic centrists. And it's difficult to do because look, everything you do, we're going to put on a campaign ad. So I don't know what they're thinking. I think the simpler explanation in reality is just that the Democrat Party has veered very, very far to the left, and there's very, very powerful demands from the base of that party. Whether it's on the forms of racial justice or the environmental movement. These are the strongest movements by far, I think. Also, transgender movement. It's an odd one because it represents so few people on an absolute basis. But this is a very strong movement within the Democrat Party, and nowhere in there did I hear working class or Labor Party. None of that. Middle class. But so it's these sort of niche issues that how do you pronounce that damn word?
Niche issues
that I just hear it pronounced differently all the time, and I always doubt myself. I shouldn't. Anyway, it's these niche issues that really drive policy making, and so you start out with this effort to just please a radical base, and it feels more like a culture war set of policies than it does real well thought out policies. Again, whether it's the transgender issues or the racial inequality issues or the environmental issues. None of these, when you really get down to the brass tacks of the policy being proposed, are pragmatic in any sense. None of them rely on an agreed upon set of facts to then an agreed upon problem that needs to be solved and then come to a logical conclusion on the solution of that problem based on a real cost benefit analysis. None of them, right? It's pure dogmatism. It's pure ideology. And that's just become the popular thing. And Biden he no longer has the wherewithal to resist that. Whereas maybe a lot of people just knowing him in politics for 40 years sort of expected that from him. But they shouldn't have. People like me said that months prior to the election, that you should not expect this man to resist the left the way you think he will. You should not expect some moderate presidency. You should not even expect an Obama presidency. You should expect something far more radical because the party itself has moved into a far more radical direction, and they don't feel like they even have to explain themselves. They don't even feel like they Go ahead.
Well, let me interrupt you, because I mean, this is the part, the disconnect, and my politics are very centrist. And I've been on the right. I wrote for a left-leaning newspaper. I was at Manhattan Institute for 9 years. I've been on both sides, and I'm just part of the disgusted party, I guess. But to me, some of the most interesting political battles are what is happening in California over these energy and climate policies, and the growing discontent, in fact, backlash coming from the Latino and African American communities saying, wait a minute, you're passing all these climate policies. These are regressive and they're hurting our people. And that's the part that, you mentioned that about the working class, that this is the part that the fact that the Republicans have become more the party of the working class than the Democrats, but the Democrats, despite their claims, these energy and climate policies that they're implementing are going to screw the poor and the middle class. Tradesmen don't work. They don't drive Teslas. They drive F-150s. They're not going to ever plug in their car at some public charging station. They don't have an EV. But the elitist approach on climate and energy is the part of the Democratic platform that, to me, just doesn't there's something that just doesn't square. And yet, as you point out, that doesn't seem to be part of their understanding of where they are or their charge. Yeah,
and I'd like to hear, it was one of the questions I had for you, actually, which was, what is their reaction? I mean, these environmental regulators in California, because they're always spewing out these talking points. I actually just responded to one right before we got on. I was on a Fox Business interview, and they repeated the oft-repeated claim of, look, it's the poor that live near highways, right, where all of this particulates are emitting from and where it's so dirty. I'm not really sure that there's evidence for that, by the way. I live by a highway. And not only that, but it's the poor that live next to these refineries. It's the poor that live next to these electrical generation plants. And so they paint this picture of this downtrodden poor person, usually somebody of color, who is just like pollution is spewing on them and they're jobless. And I'm like, this is just so out of touch. This is just not true. What is true is that these are the places where a lot of these middle class and low income people actually work and provide for their families. All right, that's the actual truth. And maybe get on the ground and actually see these communities and see who is working at these supposedly evil refineries, and also see who you're hurting when you deliberately jack up electricity prices, when you deliberately jack up gas prices, when you tell people to just go get a job in the solar and wind industry. Well, on average, those jobs pay $20,000 less than a job in the oil and gas sector. And so if you're going to make that sacrifice, if you're going to demand that sacrifice, like, what are we getting for it? I mean, that's probably the next part of our conversation is what do we get from an environmental standpoint by even doing these things? But I mean, first, maybe let's stick to the poor.
I'll interrupt you. Well, yeah, sure, but I'll interrupt you there, because I think that's one of the things that's been on my mind. Biden just announced this freeze on federal leasing. Well, okay, so let's just, the rhetoric is they want to put the oil and gas industry out of business, right? Well, okay, rough terms, that's 2 million jobs, give or take. I mean, we can argue over those. Let's call it a million people in the oil and gas sector. Well, they're saying, we're going to create millions of jobs in green industries. Well, but you're starting from minus 1 million then. So it's not just that you have to create these million more jobs. You've destroyed a bunch of jobs already. So that's one thing. And I think that's again, a paycheck issue, poor and the low income and middle income people. But yeah, I think that, I mean, to your point about the disadvantaged communities, and, in fact, if you read the statements from the mayor of Oakland, the mayor of San Jose, the mayor of Seattle, after they passed the natural gas bans, it's boilerplate. Well, we're looking out for the disadvantaged communities, and this is we're going to help them out. And how much do they really mean it, or how much of it is boilerplate? My read is that a lot of it, this is just a boilerplate salute to the poor and the middle class. But you're right. I mean, these are very regressive policies. Natural gas, you ban natural gas, you force consumers to buy electricity at 4 times the cost of natural gas on a BTU basis. Well, that's a regressive tax. in every sense. But of course, that's not what it's called, because climate change, and that's the trump card.
It's called environmental justice. Whatever the heck that means. Maybe. Well, what does it mean when you hear that? I mean, have you written about the term? What do they really mean by that?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I was there's a very clever guy named Tony Reams who teaches at University of Michigan, and he's looked at a lot of these energy and climate policies, and he uses a different term. He calls it energy justice, which I think is that access issue is one that I think, and to low cost energy services, I think that's a really good term. So, but he's one of the few that have used that, and I like that.
So that's our counter. That's good. Yeah, that's a good counter. What about energy justice?
I think. Yeah. What about energy justice? Because people they don't have a choice about paying their electricity bill. They don't have a choice about paying their natural gas bill. Either they pay it or they get cut off.
Let's talk about the fantasy of like, oh, you're just going to get a solar job. I mean, I think I just tweeted like literally an hour ago at John Kerry for saying that, like, look, they're just going to go get those solar panel jobs. I'm trying to do a John Kerry voice right now. And it's like, what do you mean just go get it?
That was a bad imitation.
It was pretty good. It was pretty good. It's just, this is my podcast and I can say it was really good. Okay. Maybe one of the best. Maybe one of the best. It was a beautiful. Like, see, now we're getting messy. Now we're.
You want my Ross Perot imitation? You want the Ross Perot imitation?
Sure.
No. First thing you do, appoint a task force.
That wasn't bad. That wasn't bad. That was pretty good. So what the heck was I talking about? Oh yeah. So this sort of fantasy of like, it's like, hey, just learn to code. Like just be a solar panel and installer. And it's like, guys, you have to know that you're making a really disingenuous argument here. I mean, the amount of disruption in somebody's life to just go get another job. And again, I already went over this. On average, $20,000 pays less. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon, by the way, because here's another statistic. It takes like 6 people to operate a solar power plant. It takes like 1,000 to operate a nuclear plant. Again, one of the reasons why nuclear might be more expensive. But if you're going to make the jobs argument, then you have to acknowledge some very basic truths, which is that there's just less jobs in this category. They pay a lot less. The manufacturing is actually happening in China. It doesn't appear to be moving here anytime soon. So, it's just wrong. I mean, it's just disingenuous on its face.
Well, the point about the solar panels. So I live in Austin. Full disclosure, I have 8.5 kilowatts of solar panels on the roof of my house. Well, why did I put them on? Because I got 3 different subsidies. I got the investment tax credit. So I wrote off $7,000 off what I owed the government. I got to deduct $7,000 from my tax bill. Well, that's a big deduction. Well, the city of Austin subsidized the solar panels. And then Austin Energy, the city-owned utility, was at one point paying me $125 per megawatt hour. That was 5 times the wholesale price of electricity in Texas. So this idea, we'll go install solar panels. Well, who's buying solar panels? Well, I consider myself lucky. Am I rich? I'm no Ross Perot, but I could afford the solar panels. But numerous studies have looked at this, that as Ashley Brown at the Harvard Electricity Project put it, he said, this is Robin Hood in reverse.
Yeah.
That wealthy and middle and upper middle class people are able to put solar panels on the roof of their houses. And I don't pay an electric bill 6 months out of the year. Well, okay, bully for me, but I'm getting a return on my investment that's pretty good. What about the barista at Starbucks? What about the school teacher that doesn't have the solar panels? They're effectively subsidizing mine. So I don't know. I'm pro solar. It has a lot to recommend it, but this idea, just get a solar panel job. Well, it's not. It's complicated.
It's very complicated. That's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. So I kind of want to try and summarize that point a little bit. Like, you have to have, despite all the subsidies, you can never subsidize it enough until it's free, I guess, until every single person in America is getting a solar panel, which is just foolish for many reasons. But even with the subsidies, you still have to be pretty high wealth to at least upper class to even buy them in the first place. Once you buy them, you're affecting the electrical grid, especially in mass. Okay. And, the question of how that works is probably something that you can describe a little bit better. But the end result of the effect of what is intermittent solar power on people's houses that interacts with the electrical grid and you actually get paid for, this affects the prices of everybody else's electrical bills and in an adverse way. And especially on the people who actually, the kind of people who actually look at their bill every month and really calculate it. Cause like I don't, right? I throw it away.
Yeah.
But there are people who need to calculate that. And these are the people it affects the most.
Well, and this is a key point because I've been paying a lot of attention to California. You know, been there times. It's a beautiful place. I don't live there, but the politics of the energy there are the most interesting of anywhere in the U.S., maybe anywhere in the world. And I did an interview with a guy who works for the Office of Ratepayer Advocate. It was on a separate story, but we talked about this issue of equity and rooftop solar. And they released a report in 2019 pointing out that the big utilities in the state are selling fewer watt hours. They're still selling less electricity. Why? Because more people are putting rooftop solar on. So the utilities are able to bill fewer. They have to spread their costs now over fewer watt hours that they're generating. Well, that problem is only going to get worse. And he said this, that problem is only going to get worse as electric rates go higher, that more and more wealthy people are effectively going to secede from the grid, get their own rooftop solar panels. The utilities then have yet fewer watt hours over which to spread their costs. Well, then that's a regressive effect on everyone who relies on that electric grid or that utility. And so this is a really difficult problem. And it's one that California is not, the assembly there is not dealing with. And it's in part because the solar lobby is so powerful. They're very effective.
Yeah, it's just a great point to make. And so I want to kind of, I don't know how much time we've got left. How long have we been going? An hour? Yeah.
Right about an hour. Yeah, I'm going to have to jump here in about 5 minutes.
Okay, so then let's end with this, a little nerdy talk about NEPA reviews and processes and whether these actually help or hurt. NEPA, well, can you explain what NEPA is? And then you're going to get me into the weeds and in trouble here real quick. Yeah, and you know how the Trump administration sees it, and how maybe we help these processes along, in permitting, et cetera. And also just and then maybe end with something I think you've written about as well, which is sort of how the environmentalist industry makes so much money off of weaponizing the court system, weaponizing these process reviews.
Well, I'm not going to claim specific knowledge on either of those topics, but one of the things that the environmental groups have been successful at is sue and settle, right? That they will sue the government, the state government, local government, national, federal government, and then they settle the case. And then those environmental groups get to share in some of those, they get lawyer fees and some of these other things. So it as a friend of mine who was a student of the Pentagon told me years ago, it's the self-licking ice cream cone. That these, the system just perpetuates itself. But I think that, broadly, rather than, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on NEPA. But I think that, the question now, I think is, as I see it, from where I sit, and you're in DC and you know these issues far better than I is the Biden administration going to continue on this path? And there were a lot of things that I desperately disliked about the Trump administration, but the deregulatory efforts I thought were in many cases the right move. And this push to re-regulate and impose more regulations, I think the system had become so onerous for a lot of people for permitting that it was important that they roll back some of that regulation. And now I think we're going to see that re-regulatory regime. And I think in many cases, it's not going to help average consumers. It's not going to help average taxpayers or people who are in the energy business. It's going to hurt them.
Yeah. And it's frustrating because I put it simply, it's basically this theory that if one environmental regulation is good, then 10 must be better, always better. And that obviously just is logically untrue. Right. The reasons regulations exist in the first place is to balance out, unmitigated development, for instance. I mean, I'm not against them, But there's this when you listen to progressive Democrats, you would almost believe that they believe that we have no regulations and that we're the freaking Wild West, which is like so far from true. I think we're probably the most overly regulated when it comes to NEPA processes. NEPA being what is like National Environmental Protection Act, I think. Basically the process in the regulatory process you have to go through to build anything these days. And people don't realize how frivolous it can get. Maybe you're expanding a highway. Well, why do you have to do an endangered species review just to expand a lane on a highway? Like, who on earth thinks that there's some endangered species living on the side of the road that would be, what are we talking about here? Like, it just becomes really absurd. And I don't think the general public realizes that. Because your average voter says and thinks to themselves, look, I am pro-environment. So the left, knowing that, can just say, well, look, this helps the environment. So a voter can just, well, yeah, I'm in favor. Oh, yeah, I'm in favor of that. But they don't know. And they unfortunately trust some of these leaders who claim to be speaking on their behalf, and it's difficult to message back against. We're just at a political disadvantage in that sense.
Yeah, it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, and that's always my test. Is it's kind of one of the reasons why the anti-oil and gas industry, and it is an industry of fighting the oil and gas. Their bumper sticker says, big oil wants to pollute your water. And what's the response is, oh, no, we don't. Well,
yeah. It's like, well, who's telling the truth? Right. Yeah. That's exactly what it is. And it's like, well,
your bumper sticker loses.
Right. And usually the truth is like, no. We have a pond that we created, and this is where wastewater goes, but it can't leak anywhere because we line it with plastic. And it's like, that's too much already. People heard dirty water. Doesn't, and it's very misleading. And that's why I do these podcasts. That's why.
What was Karl Rove's line? If you're explaining, you're losing.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's why we do this. Anything else to add before you got to go?
No, I think this has been great, Dan. I love these issues. I'm passionate about them. Just a couple things. I know your staff did a great job. I think they contacted me through Hannah or Kara Jones at Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. If your listeners want to see my paper that I did for them on natural gas bans in California, they could go to freeop.org and find it there. They can find me on the web, robertbryce.com. I'm on Twitter at Power Hungry, PWR Hungry. So I'm on the interweb. I'm easy to find on the Google. So yeah,
great.
Happy to be. Let's do it again.
Yeah. Well, Robert, appreciate you being on. Appreciate all your work on this on these important issues.